Hello and welcome to Bags of Action. This episode is a break from our usual format. I won't be joined by Steve to dissect an action movie. Instead, I'll be interviewing a very special guest. Joining me on the show today is Timon Singh, founder of Bristol Bad Film Club, producer of the upcoming documentary In Search of the Last Action Heroes, co-host of the Cosmic Shed podcast, and most importantly for us, author of recent action movie Born to be Bad. Sounds even busier than me. Welcome to the show, Ty.
Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So it's great to have you here. So just from mentioning those things that you've done, you obviously have a long history with the action movie genre. So I want to take you right back. Can you remember what the first action movie you remember seeing was?
First action movie? I guess it all depends what we mean by action films, because growing up, my parents were fairly laid back in what I watched.
Okay.
And so I always used to watch James Bond movies with my dad. The Indiana Jones films were a staple. But actually, as a kid, I was rather squeamish when it came to violence. I remember being at my uncle's place, and him and my dad were watching Predator, and I walked in, and I must have been about 10, just as Bill Duke's head explodes. I remember just being freaked out by the violence and doing, a 180 turn and just walking out the room going, nope, that was horrible.
I had a similar experience with Alien, actually, probably even younger than that, with the chest bursting scene. So yeah, I feel your pain.
No, it was weird. I actually remember being even younger and seeing the the Black Knight scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where they cut off his limbs.
Yeah,
and it's hilarious now, but to a young kid who had no idea what Monty Python was or anything, I remember feeling extremely queasy at that scene and asking my aunt if she would go out the room with me so we could play some table football somewhere else. And yeah, I don't think it was till I was about 12 or 13. I had a friend called Mike who was always ahead of the curve in, what great films were out there. And he introduced me to films like Mad Max 2 and Commando. And I think that was when I really kind of just got into action films and loved them for their, crazy amount of actions, how satirical they could be at times, and just how insane some of them were. So I think that's kind of really how I got into action movies.
Yeah, so those are the things that kind of drew you in and made it a genre that you're interested in?
Yeah, I think it was like, when you're 12 and 13, you're staying over at your mate's house and you're watching films that basically you're far too young to be watching. And those were the films I remember watching. It was Commando, it was Mad Max 2, it was The Running Man. And it was those films that kind of created my love for the 80s action genre. But then, as you get older and you explore the genre, you find things like, Michael Dudikoff in the American Ninja films. And then you have uncles introducing you to, Bruce Lee films. And then I think it was around 1995 when Rumble in the Bronx was being released into UK theatres. Channel 4 did a whole retrospective on some of the classic Jackie Chan films like Project A and Police Story, and then you discover films that way. So it was everything and anything, really.
Great. Okay. Yeah, it sounds very, very, very similar to myself, and I'd imagine to Steve, our co-host, as well. So one of the reasons I asked you to come on was saw you at London Film Comic Con recently with your new book, Born to be Bad. So can you tell us a bit about what the book's about?
Yeah, so Born to be Bad came out last year, and it's basically me tracking down the actors who played some of the most iconic bad guys from 80s and 90s action films. So I came up with the idea a couple of years ago when I was watching Robocop for the 100th time. And it struck me that all the actors playing bad guys are actors that you probably wouldn't have thought to cast as bad guys. People like Ronny Cox, who was like in Deliverance and Beverly Hills Cop, and Kurtwood Smith and Paul McCrane, who was in Fame. And it kind of got me thinking, how the hell did all these actors end up in this film as bad guys? What were their experiences like? Did it change their career for the better being cast as a bad guy? Or did they forever get typecast in that role? So what I decided to do after I kind of came up, after watching Robocop, was instead of just tracking down the Robocop actors, I was going to track down every iconic bad guy from my childhood. So Vernon Wells from Mad Max and Commando, the the terrorists from Die Hard, Bob Wall from Enter the Dragon, any Bond henchmen that I could get hold of. And it just turned into a whole big collection of about 30 interviews of just kind of some of the most familiar faces that many of your listeners will be familiar with, from people like David Warner, the British thespian who played Sark in Tron and was in Time After Time and Titanic, to people like Al Leon, who played every Asian henchman in every 80s action film ever. So it's a real diverse mix.
Yeah. And one of my personal favourites, who gets mentioned a lot on the show, Sven-Ole Thorsen, I believe, is the who opens the book, the first interview.
Yeah, he was one of the first interviews that I did, simply because he's been in so many action films, often as kind of like a background henchman, but he's worked with everyone. Yeah, he was one of Arnold's closest friends, but he's been in films like Hard Target with Jean-Claude Van Damme, On Deadly Ground with Steven Seagal. So I was like, this guy is going to have some fucking crazy stories, and he did not disappoint. I kind of put his chapter front and center because I personally think it's one of the best interviews in the book. He does not pull any punches about his experiences working with some of the biggest names in action films. He does not filter his experiences at all. And that's another kind of the reason why I did the book, because if you're talking to people like Schwarzenegger or Stallone, they're going to have publicists or, a team that are going to be monitoring what they say. Whereas people like Sven, who've just been in every action film, but, they are not A-list stars. They do not remotely give a shit about, what they say. And, that's refreshing.
No, that makes sense. One of the things I was going to say, actually, is that, so did someone give you, what was the most, without, you don't have to spoil the actual story, but who gave you kind of the most out there or unbelievable story, or the story you hadn't heard anything about before?
Sven obviously had some crazy stories about his time working with Steven Seagal, so that was great. But it was great to kind of speak to actors like Al Leon and Bill Duke about their experiences, because obviously they are actors of color who often get stereotyped into various things. So in the 80s, Al, he's a stuntman, as he would like to say. He's not an actor, so he didn't mind kind of getting typecast in those roles. But Bill Duke was very conscious of the fact that, he's 6'1", 230 pounds, and for young black men to be constantly portrayed as bad guys probably isn't the best thing. So he made a very conscious choice that he was going to play, police officers or army officers, inspirational figures, so that, young black men just weren't seeing themselves as bad guys in films.
Well, that's good. And he moved into directing, is that right? I don't know if he got onto that subject when he was talking to you. I think he moved into directing as well at one point.
Yeah, he directed Sister Act 2, Back in Habit. Not many people will know that, but yeah, he's a director, producer, and the Bill Duke Foundation has been set up to help, black men and women kind of get into filmmaking.
Oh, that's great. That's great to hear. I think he's one of those people, a bit like Al Young, that you just kind of, when you're the right age and you see someone in one film and they kind of make a real impression on you just because of their performance and kind of the way they carry themselves, and then suddenly you see them in a second film, and then it's when you notice them maybe on a third film, you go, oh, okay, and I certainly got to stage, and I imagine you were the same. You're almost looking out for lower down the cast rather than the main stars, as the people that might be part of the draw for some of these movies.
Exactly. I mean, someone like an Alan Rickman in Die Hard. Unfortunately, Alan died before I could interview him for the book. But when everyone thinks of Die Hard, they think of Alan Rickman. But there are a whole bunch of faces behind him that have great stories. So there was like Andreas Winewski, who played Tony, Carl's brother, who's killed at the beginning of the film. And Andreas played the henchman Necros in the Bond film The Living Daylights. So he was kind of already established. He had already done a Bond film, and Die Hard was going to be his next big break. But, apart from appearing in Mission Impossible as Vanessa Redgrave's bodyguard, and he also shows up in Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, his career never really took off. And then you also have actors like Dennis Hayden, who plays the terrorist on the front desk. He was in films like Action Jackson and Sniper 2, and he's had a really varied career. But he was faced with the dilemma that many people thought that his character was played by Huey Lewis and not himself.
Okay.
That's a whole other challenge where people are like, oh, I remember that character. That was Huey Lewis. And of course, there was not an IMDb in the He could really prove that it was him in that role and not, the guy who sung the power.
Yeah, I think, growing up, I think we were probably the human IMDbs for our friends. Because they'd be going, well, who's that? What's they been in? And we'd be reading it off. They'd be like, no, they weren't in that. And that was the most frustrating thing as a teenager, was friends kind of going, no, I don't think they were in that. And you could swear blind that they were. At least we do know that. But I guess it's a challenge, really, particularly if you're playing more of a kind of henchman role rather than maybe a more three-dimensional character that, like you say, you could get easily typecast into similar roles.
You could, or you just disappear into those roles. So before IMDb, obviously, I watched films like Commando and The Warriors and The Crow. But it wasn't until probably my early 20s that I realized that David Patrick Kelly, Sully in Commando, and he's T-Bird in The Crow, and he's Luther in The Warriors, because he's so different in each of those films that you would have no idea unless, there was an IMDb or you were very familiar with the work of David Patrick Kelly, which, as a young 12 or 13-year-old, I wasn't. So... it's weird that, when you're talking to these actors, you're just like, oh my God, you're in this as well. And you're in this. And of course you did, Twin Peaks. And it's crazy. People's careers go off in so many different directions and no one has the same story.
So of the interviews that you did, which was the one you were most surprised to be able to get? Who was the one you maybe weren't expecting to be able to speak to?
Stephen Berkoff.
Okay, I get that.
Because obviously Stephen Berkoff has a reputation of being really intense, a bit grumpy, a bit terrifying, and I'd already been told no by his people, and I really felt I needed a couple of big English thespians in the book, and I kind of kept pushing them until eventually they went, yes, fine, all right. He's agreed. You've got 30 minutes with him. And it was the most terrified I've ever been for an interview. It was one of those moments where it's like, yes, I've got Stephen Berkoff. And then, fuck, I've got Berkoff.
Yeah.
How am I going to do this? And luckily for me, he was one of those actors where you just ask him a question and he will just go. But that meant I had to get all my questions into 30 minutes because at the end of that 30 minutes, he went, is that it? Because I've got other things to do now. And I was like, no, that was it. And he just put the phone straight down. So, everything you've heard about Stephen Berkoff, I imagine is true.
Okay. So is there anyone that you kind of didn't manage to get, or maybe you can't say, or maybe you wish would be in there, or maybe if you did another book that you might want to do a sequel? Or
I'm actually working on a sequel at the moment.
There you go.
So there were loads of actors I didn't get first time round. When I was writing it, I really wanted to interview Powers Booth, and his people said that yes, he would be up for it. And then a month later, he tragically died. That was heartbreaking. And then, there were actors who were really busy, such as Robert Patrick, the T-1000, and Clancy Brown from the Highlander films, and Kurtwood Smith. So I am about halfway through the sequel, and I've done about 12 interviews, and some of those people I've managed to get this time. And, obviously while we were at the London Film TV Comic Con, there were loads of actors there, and I managed to bump into Jason Isaacs and ask him if I could interview him for it, because obviously he started off playing, henchmen in films like Dragonheart, and then he was the main bad guy in Mel Gibson's The Patriot, where he got a lot of flack from British tabloids for daring to play a bad guy in an American film about independence. So that man has got some crazy stories. And I think because of the Harry Potter films, obviously, he's familiar to a whole other generation of film goers. But I think those early films, The Patriot, Dragonheart, even Event Horizon, where he's not a villain, but that's just a crazy film. I think I'd like to talk to him about those films that maybe he's not asked about so often.
That makes sense. I remember seeing Lance. I didn't get a chance to speak to Lance Henriksen, but he was at a convention a few years back, and I think most people wanted to speak to him about Alien. And I was there thinking, I want to talk to him about Hard Target. I want to talk to him about Stone Cold, but unfortunately, I didn't manage to speak to him. But maybe we shall see.
I think many actors appreciate that. So I've already announced it on my social media, but for the new book, I actually managed to get to speak to Robert Patrick, who was obviously the T-1000 in Terminator 2. And he was like, all people want to talk to me about is Terminator 2 and occasionally the X-Files. And I think you kind of really appreciated it, that I wanted to talk to him about Double Dragon. I wanted to talk to him about how he ended up in Die Hard 2 as one of William Sadler's band of brothers. I wanted to talk to him about his, direct-to-video wilderness years, where he was making crappy thrillers like Hong Kong 97 with Ming-Na Wen and, Copland. And I think he really appreciated it, because all these actors, we know them for, they're probably their most iconic roles, and they probably got the same questions asked them millions and millions of times. But if you go up to someone like Robert Patrick and kind of go, what was it like making Double Dragon with Mark Dacascos, and why do you have a bleached, haircut? He is like well up for talking about it, rather than tell me
same old, in
Terminator 2, which he's probably asked countless times a day.
Yeah, it was interesting because Franco Nero was at the convention we were both at, and it is big sign with a list of films. I'm thinking, hang on a sec, the film that one of the seminal films for me, again, that kind of thing, I was at my cousin's house and much too young to see it, which was Enter the Ninja. So I saw Enter the Ninja way before I saw Enter the Dragon. But I didn't manage to speak to him either. I'm rubbish at this going up and speaking to people thing. But maybe the next show.
Yeah, it didn't have any of the canon films that he did, because obviously he did, Sam Furstenberg's Enter the Ninja. And you would have thought of something like the Film and TV Comic-Con. That is that kind of genre title that they would push. But, it was kind of Die Hard 2, Django Unchained, and, the...
John Wick 2 as well, I think. Yeah.
And he's the head of Continental in John Wick 2, which is, great. I mean, and a man like that's done so many. And I did think about talking to him, but I think he's played more heroes than bad guys. Yeah. I mean, we remember him as General Esperanza in Die Hard 2, but I think that's more the exception than the rule.
Okay. So what was the biggest challenge in bringing the book together?
I guess the biggest challenge was just getting people to say yes. So many actors, I had a big list. It was just basically persuading them to talk to me, who at the time, I'd done some freelance writing for websites like Den of Geek, and I'd done some freelance film writing, but, I didn't really have anything big to my name. So it was persuading, these actors to talk to me. And then luckily one of the first people that said yes was Vernon Wells. So then once you have kind of Vernon Wells under your belt, you get other people kind of going, oh, it seems legit. If he's spoken to Vernon, that's fine. But then you have some actors who want paying for interviews, which I wasn't going to do because that kind of sets a precedent. There are some with outrageous demands for getting paid that were just laughable, some of whom haven't been in anything good for over a decade. And you're kind of like, you're taking the piss to a degree. So I think that was the challenge, getting people to say yes and then working around their schedules, because some of them are very busy and still working, and just some have other things going on. Martin Kove, who's Kreese in The Karate Kid, and Cobra Kai, he said yes to the interview 6 months before we actually did the interview, because he was working, one of his kids has had a grandkid, so he was just all over the place in terms of his commitment, so it was just hard to nail him down. But, eventually I managed to do it 3 days before I had to submit the book to the publishers.
Oh, okay. Let's get right at the wire.
Right, yeah.
So yeah, we'll Yeah, so just obviously there's a documentary you're producing as well. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about that as well?
Yeah, so Oliver Harper, who some of your listeners might know, is a YouTuber that specializes in 80s action films and does these great retrospectives. And when my book came out, he had literally that week just announced the Kickstarter for it. Mm-hmm. So I kind of got in touch with the team and I was like, look, I see you guys pulling together this this documentary on 80s action films. I've literally just written this book where I've interviewed a bunch of actors. So I have contacts if you are looking for a research guy. And Oliver and the team kind of brought me on as a full-on producer and, writer to help shape the story. And then I was able to reach out to a lot of the people that I'd previously interviewed, as well as loads of other people that we interviewed for the film, including Mario Casar, the executive producer and creator of Calco Pictures that did the Rambo films and Terminator 2 and Cutthroat Island, Sam Furstenberg of the Cannon films, Graham Yost, who wrote Speed and Broken Arrow, and Eric Roberts and Philip Ree from the Best of the Best films. So Oliver did a lot of the interviews in the UK. So he interviewed people like Brad Fiedel, who did the Terminator scores, and Peter McDonald. And then I went to LA to interview, everyone else for essentially a 10-day period. And so while I was out there, I got to meet up with a bunch of people I'd interviewed with for my book and give them a copy in person. People like Al Leon and Ronny Cox and Vernon Wells. And yeah, it was a crazy week and a half that was just jam-packed full of interviews and, very surreal finally meeting all these actors face to face that you've watched all your life and, previously interviewed. And now you can give them a book kind of going, see, I wasn't lying that, I was actually writing a book.
Nicely done. That's nice to follow that as well, from kind of getting one person to do the book, the domino effect to getting other people, and then to the film, then meeting people. That's great. Yeah, well done. Sounds brilliant.
Once you have a Vernon Wells or a Ronny Cox on board, then it gives your project a little bit of credibility.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the place that I first became aware of you was actually from Bristol Bad Film Club. So I think we should probably have a little bit of a chat about that.
Yeah, so the Bristol Bad Film Club I've been running for almost 6 years now. And this kind of comes from, my love of, let's say, less than great action films. So we're talking about the Cannon films here, things like Ninja 3, The Domination, which is a crazy film. It's like Flashdance meets The Exorcist meets, Enter the Ninja. It's crazy. For any of your listeners that haven't seen it, basically a gymnastics instructor is possessed by the spirit of a ninja assassin and goes on a killing spree. It's crazy. But
it's an underworked genre, I have to say.
It's one of those crazy films that you can't believe actually exists. But my dad would always go to the video shop, and he would often come back with films of the Cannon ilk, because he would literally judge a film by its cover. So because of that, you would get Richard Chamberlain and King Solomon's Mines, because my dad would, through no fault of his own, think it was an Indiana Jones film. That's what these films were made to do. Into buying it. So I developed a love very early on for the fun, but let's face it, rather crap action film. And my love for B movies, and in many cases C movies, led me to set up the Bristol Bad Film Club, where once a month I screen and introduce a film that is so bad it's terrible or has some sort of fascinating story behind it. It's the kind of film that doesn't often get shown, and we donate all the money from the evening to a different charity each month. So we've shown films like, of course, The Room and Birdemic Shock and Terror, but also films like Samurai Cop or Miami Connection, which is about a Taekwondo rock band that fights drug smuggling ninjas, and Ninja 3 The Domination has been screened, and also Pulgasari, which is the North Korean Godzilla ripoff, where the story on how that was made is much more interesting than the film itself, because Kim Jong-il kidnapped the South Korean director and his wife and held them for 7 years and forced them to make films for him until they basically defected while on a location shoot in, I think it was the Czech Republic. There's a really good documentary on Netflix called The Lovers and the Despots, which really tells this story, and it's insane. But that is kind of what the Bristol Bad Film Club is all about. We show films that, no theatre in its right mind would generally show, films that were often just released on VHS. And we try and put all the money to, a worthy cause.
That's great. That's great. So, yeah, thank you very much for joining me today. And so where can people get hold of a copy of Born to be Bad?
So Born to be Bad is obviously on all massive corporate conglomerate websites, such as your Amazons. The publisher, Bear Manor Media, they sell it on their website. It's a US publisher, so for your UK listeners, they would probably have to import it, but they also sell a hardcover version, which is rather cool. There is a Kindle version, obviously, on Amazon. But yeah, why not just go to your local bookshop and ask them to order it in? That's what I do. So yeah, it should be readily available.
Perfect. And so where can people find you on social media if they want to find out more?
So I'm on Twitter as at Timon Singh. I'm also on Twitter as the Bad Film Club, which is the other BBFC. I've got a website, which is basically the Bristol Bad Film Club's website. If you either go to bristolbadfilmclub.co.uk or borntobebad.co.uk, it will take you to the same place. So yeah, that's where you can find me. And also there is a Born to be Bad page on Facebook.
Brilliant. One final very important question.
Go on.
How do you pronounce the person who plays Connor McLeod in Highlander?
So I always thought it's Christophe Lambert.
See, you are officially my favourite guest we've ever had, and because I'm with you all the way.
Yeah, Christopher Lambert or Christophe Lambert.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Ty. Thanks very much for coming on. So don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll find our full episodes and some special 5-minute film reviews too. Write us a review on iTunes while it still exists. Follow us on Twitter at Bags of Action and join the Bags of Action Facebook group. Thank you for listening, if indeed you still are.